Let's take a closer look at 5 of the songs from the Rubber Soul album. And again, I want to start by saying that it's certainly the case that I'm looking for the features that are more progressive in these songs, because I'm telling a story about how the Beatles are moving, as I've said a number of times this week, from craftsman to artist. So when you do that, you run the risk of maybe emphasizing it so much that you give people the impression that that's all that's going on. So I just want to remind you that while these progressive features are going on that I'm highlighting, there's an awful lot of kind of normative, old craft kind of stuff hanging over from what the group had been doing in '63 and '64. So I'm really sort of picking out the things that really push in the direction of where they're going, knowing where they're going. And so in many ways, it's a bit of a skewed read in a certain kind of way. Having said that, maybe makes it a little less skewed, because you can judge for yourself as you work through these tunes, listen to them, and watch them go by. And let's talk first about Norwegian Wood. I've already said a bit about this, one of the John songs. This is a fun one from a form point of view, because the form is a kind of a large-scale A-B-A form. Now, we've talked about A-A-B-A, but we haven't yet seen a form that kind of goes A-B-A, and then it repeats all that again, A-B-A again. So there's an intro, A-B-A, A-B-A, and then a coda. To my knowledge, this is the only tune like this on these records, these Beatle records that we're talking about in this course. And, you know, it's not the only song that's a kind of a one-time form. You know, we talked about one a couple of weeks ago from an early record, but the idea that this form goes exactly how the tune needs to go and then isn't reproduced again and again, like, for example, the Beatles' contrasting verse-chorus form is, says to me something about the change in attitude with regard to the Beatles and their approach to their music, trying to say something new. Interestingly, for those of you who have got some musical training, when you look at the verse sections of this tune and the verse and the choruses, it's an interesting blend of E Mixolydian and then Dorian and then Ionian. So there's a kind of a modal mixture that occurs in here that kind of blends 3 different modes together in an interesting kind of way that doesn't really quite fit some of the things the Beatles have done in the past, or not very closely. Of course, the big thing about this tune, the use of sitar. George Harrison, having sort of discovered the sitar earlier in the year when they were filming Help Now, he's had some lessons and he's been working on it. And so they work out a version of the tune that uses the sitar. In fact, there are other versions, you can hear them on the Beatles anthology, where there's a lot more sitar on the track. Apparently at one point it was going to be very sitar heavy, but somebody decided, maybe we need to dial the sitar back just a little bit. And so we have the one that everybody is used to. Again, the use of the acoustic guitar, which again, these are all sort of indicators of authenticity, kind of folk music, sincerity, this kind of thing. The lyrics are a song that really tells a story about a guy who gets together with a girl. He thinks that maybe they go to her apartment. He thinks that maybe this is going to get romantic and sexual. But in the end, he wakes up and she's gone and nothing ever happened overnight. And so in the end, he burns her apartment down. Now, look, this is a pretty crazy reaction to a date that didn't work out quite the right way, and people have said, God, this is a little misogynist, really. Is this the way you treat your women, And so the whole time through, she's talking about her apartment and this blonde wood that she has throughout the apartment, which was very stylish at the time, not much furniture, almost looked like it was from a magazine, saying, isn't it beautiful Norwegian wood? And at the end, the protagonist is essentially going, yeah, it's great wood, it burns real good, this kind of thing. And so this sort of surprise ending shows, well, aside from the fact that it's, not the proudest moment maybe in Beatle lyrics from that point of view, but it shows a real attention to detail, to trying to do something with the lyrics that they haven't really quite done before, and that's to kind of tell a story with a tricky kind of ending and this kind of thing. This is how, in many ways, Norwegian Wood is, the lyrics to it are disputed by the guys inside the group, because everybody thinks they came up with that twist at the end. They all want to take credit for lighting the Norwegian wood in the apartment. Anyway, it shows a lot of the characteristics of authenticity and the artist model that we've been following. The second John Lennon song I want to talk about is In My Life. I said a bit about this already in the previous video. This, from a form point of view, is a very interesting song because it's what I would call a simple verse song, but the verse itself is actually very complicated, sort of falling into kind of two large kind of sections. But there's no chorus that really comes back. There's a refrain at the end of the verse. And so you just get this big complicated verse and then a repeat of the complicated verse and then a harpsichord solo for the first half of the complicated verse and then the second half of the complicated verse and a tag. So it really just sort of does that same big structure 3 times and then tags. What I'm calling the harpsichord solo is not actually a harpsichord. It's actually a piano that was recorded at half speed. And the way these tape decks work is that when you record something at half speed, if you play it an octave lower and half as fast, when you speed it up, it will go up an octave to regular pitch, and the tempo will be where you want it to be. And so you can play something that's particularly complicated, half speed, which a lot of musicians are happy to be able to do, but play it an octave low on an instrument like a piano, and then speed it up, and all of a sudden it's absolutely perfect and you haven't had to play it at that sort of breakneck speed. The reason why the Beatles did this is not because George Martin couldn't play the harpsichord parts, because they didn't have a harpsichord available to them. So by taking the piano and recording it slow and then speeding up, they were able to give the timbre of the piano a kind of brittleness that makes it sound like a harpsichord. And a lot of people really think of this as being a harpsichord in this piece. Now for us, it's interesting that it's, again, referencing classical music. Like the strings in Yesterday, we're seeing classical music working its way into Beatles music. Michelle is, as I said before, kind of Paul's continuation of Yesterday, but now instead of going in the direction of the kind of chamber strings, he's gone in the direction of a kind of French pop style, apparently, as one of the stories goes that gets told about this song. This was a kind of a tune that Paul used to do at parties to kind of, entertain people for the fun of it, pretending that he was a Parisian pop singer, and kind of doing kind of nonsense French. And he actually got the lyrics translated by a friend of his wife who taught French in school, and so she was able to take the lyrics and turn them into French. And so that's the verse that you hear in French are essentially the English lyrics translated into French, but by somebody else. The form of the tune is one of these broken AABA forms. We talked about that with regard to Nowhere Man. I take it as an indication of the Beatles not being happy with just an AABA form. So what you get in Michelle is a verse, a bridge, a verse, and then a bridge and a verse, and then a bridge and a verse. So it starts with an intro, and you get AABA, BA, BA, and then the coda or the ending at the very end of the thing. And so this broken AABA, something that you see really 65 into 66, there are a number of instances of this, this broken AABA that come up. Again, a way of breaking out of what might be seen as the restraints, the constraints of the AABA form and the popular craft model. One last thing I'd like to draw your attention to as you listen to this song, listen to the background vocals. It's almost like the harmony vocals in the background are taking the place of the accordion in French music. So as you listen to them singing in the background, they're essentially sort of playing the role of the French accordion while Paul does his French pop singer thing. The second Paul song I want to talk about is I'm Looking Through You. Again, not a real likely candidate for songs from these albums, but I'm picking it because it shows a kind of a through point for Paul as a composer. The form itself is conservative. It's an AABA form with a partial reprise, so it goes AABA, BA. That part of it does not push in any sort of new direction. You've got the acoustic guitar here, and it's related to I've Just Seen a Face from that point of view. Paul sort of sitting at the acoustic guitar singing along, so there's that kind of folk authenticity kind of thing going on. But now the metaphors in the verses are more systematic, not fully systematic, but a little bit more systematic. So we've got an AABA form here, right? So we've got 3 times when the A comes back. We're not going to worry so much about the lyrics in the B section. In the first verse, he uses the metaphor of vision. In the second verse, he uses the metaphor of sound. So if this were a Coursera class on songwriting, of which there is one, by the way, we might say, well, if you've done a verse on vision and you've done a verse on sound, you should try to find another verse that hooks into the metaphors you've been using in the senses. I mentioned that a little bit earlier when I was talking about I've just seen a face. But Paul doesn't do that. Instead of going with something like feeling, right, touch, I'm feeling, whatever, I'm feeling something, you know. Instead, he goes with thought, and talking about thinking of me. And so the metaphors are not absolutely consistent in a textbook kind of way, but you can see what he's working with, right? He starts with vision, he goes to sound, he goes to thought, all ways of kind of working the lyrics out so there's a kind of a coherence inside of a song that really is trying to get away from the teenage romance, I love you, she loves me, let's hold hands kind of thing. The last song I want to talk about in this close-up is a George Harrison song, and the first George Harrison song we'll look at in any detail, and that's If I Needed Someone. What we can see happening in the early George Harrison songs is maybe George being one step behind the other Beatles in terms of his use of form and materials. He's really still, at this point, still trying to master the craft of writing a pop song. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney have done that and are pushing off in other directions, George is really just trying to master the craft here. And so we get a song that's an AABA form with a full reprise. So it goes AABA, AABA, there's an intro and a coda at either end, but it is a masterful use of AABA form and a fantastically crafted pop song. It's especially noteworthy for its use of the electric 12-string guitar. And remember, we talked about how important the electric 12-string guitar was in A Hard Day's Night. We told the whole story about how it's used throughout that album, was used in the movie, and how the Byrds and Roger McGuinn and all those guys sort of saw George using the Rickenbacker electric 12-string and had to have one. Now what he's doing is he's capoing the guitar at the 7th fret, which means he's got that little thing that wraps around the guitar neck to capo it off. He capos it off and then plays kind of open chords, that is chords that have strings ringing that you don't hold down with your fingers, and you get this real sort of chimey, jingly, jangly kind of sound and a great little sort of 12-string guitar lick that goes all the way through the tune that really makes this a fantastic pop tune in its own right. I would argue that if I Needed Someone had been done in this way by another group who weren't called the Beatles in 1965, early 1966, it might well have been a hit in its own right. The only thing this tune had going against it is it was on an album with a bunch of songs by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but I can guarantee you there are a lot of groups that would have been happy to have had this as the top song in their repertory at about this time. So, from here on out, I think we can start thinking about George Harrison as being a songwriter who is really, if not keeping complete pace with John and Paul, he's not too far behind them. By the time we get to Abbey Road, some people would say that the best songs on the record are George Harrison songs. We'll see what you think when we get there. So as we get to the end of this week, let's just review what we've said about 1965. Of course, the Beatles' success continues throughout 1965. In the first half of the year, we see the continued success of Beatles for Sale, which, as you remember, was released in December of 1964, so that washes over into the beginning of 1965. We get a couple of hit singles in the spring of 1965. The Help movie debuts in the summer of 1965. There's the movie, the film. Singles are released along with that. And then we get Rubber Soul at the end of the year, December of 1965, with Nowhere Man spilling over into early 1966. As I've said throughout this week, the Beatles move increasingly toward the artist model. The lyrics become more serious, as we've seen. The forms become more varied, although the AABA forms do not disappear and still play an important role. New instruments are beginning to be used. We're talking about flutes, strings, sitar, this kind of thing, harpsichord or faux harpsichord, whatever that was. And styles outside of rock begin to be employed. The French folk song, Indian music, classical music. We'll begin to see more and more of that. We'll continue to see more and more of that as we work our way forward. So next week, we'll have a look at Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and Magical Mystery Tour. We'll be on our way toward the full-blown artist model and psychedelia, so buckle your seatbelts.